So there were two questions in the chat that we have to work with. And as I admitted earlier, the very first one is, which apostle would look best in drag? And I must admit that that one absolutely stumped me because we just don't know enough about them. And we certainly don't know what they look like. So I can't immediately say who would have worn it best, because I don't know what any of their bodies would have looked like necessarily. I don't know, where they came from, what their genetic lineage was, any of that stuff. It is interesting given the little bits of their personalities we get to see, but what was Andrew like? I don't know. I really don't know. They don't talk that much about him. He was sort of there. Um, I don't know. It's tempting to say, there's James and John, and they were arguing over who's the greatest, and that just feels very like I'm better than no, I'm better, I'm better. Sort of middle school girl catfight thing. But also, I don't know. I don't know. So that one kind of has me stumped. I will absolutely and completely admit. I have a funny feeling y'all have feelings about that. So go ahead with those. Um, they mostly looked alike, similar to the dwarves of the Hobbit. Men in robes, beards of similar areas looking, yeah. And certainly several of them were brothers. So there is very, very likely to have been family resemblance between them. So, if James looked good in drag, then um, uh, possibly John would have done also. Although, genetics aren't everything. Many of you know my kids, and that's hilarious. So yeah, not real sure about that one. If you all have feelings about who would have looked best in drag, please feel free to drop those in the chat because I'm not sure. I really did put quite a lot of thought into that too. So, I've tried really hard. But yeah, an apostle drag show would be really, really cool. Stick them all in, and then we can judge. The second question in there was what was the deal with Timothy? Which is a much more easily answered question, and yet it's not at the same time. So, I'm gonna put some context to this before I even attempt to answer it, and I'm not sure it's an answer, but we're gonna work on it. So, the first letter of I focused harder on the first letter to Timothy. There are two letters to Timothy and a letter to Titus, and those together are called the pastoral epistles. I don't really know why, because they're not particularly pastoral, but cheers. They are purported to have been written by the Apostle Paul. Most scholars believe that is not, in fact, the case because the language use does not sound like Paul, not even a little bit. And actually, quite a lot of the theology in those letters very, very clearly contradicts the theology that Paul espoused in the letters that we know he actually did write, which are First and Second Corinthians, First Thessalonians, and Romans. Those are the ones off the top of my head. I'm missing something in there, but I don't remember what right now. Anyway, the odds are very good that Timothy, the pastoral epistles, Timothy, and Titus, were written solidly 100 to 150 years after Paul. So we're looking really at the end, at the early part of the second century to the later part of the second century. And the questions that are raised in those really come very much out of that particular time period. And we'll circle back to that in a minute. But the other part of the context here is that these letters, like all of the letters of Paul, are being written to churches that had formed in and around the Mediterranean basin, all of which were considered part of the Roman Empire, and many of which were very, very much in a region, in an area that would have been not only deeply Roman, but even before that would have been deeply Greek. Timothy was supposed to have stayed in Ephesus. which is in modern day Greece. And so the culture in the area to which this letter is being addressed, and really a hefty chunk of the culture of most of those churches, or at least what would be the dominant culture around them, would have developed deeply out of Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy, Plato, Plutarch, all them people, um, was very, very rigid. It was very much into categorizing things and creating hierarchies. I don't know if any of you have read Plato's Republic. That is essentially his whole premise, is that there are, categories of things, and staying within your category is a virtue. That is actually one of the primary virtues, is knowing how you land in this classification of things, and then doing that really well. In that classification of things, there were hierarchies according to class, there were hierarchies according to gender, there were hierarchies according to age. That was a big one, actually. There are hierarchies according to education, although that sort of falls under the category of class. So among that, in that school of thought, the top, the pinnacle that you could be was a well-educated, fairly wealthy Greek male of somewhat advanced age. I mean, they actually really appreciated, the wisdom of age, but a competent adult male. That was the pinnacle of creation in Hellenistic, Aristotelian, Platonic, even Stoic philosophy. And they didn't necessarily talk about women as being less than men, although that was sort of the underwritten understanding, or but it was more that women had a different category, a different role to fill, a different sphere of influence, and that everyone had to stay in their lane, because otherwise it offended the right and proper order of things. Yeah, and yes, you are, all of you who are in that Rochester area, please be careful out there, because there was a nasty string of thunderstorms rolling through. I was watching those. In any event, and this is what we begin to see play out in the early church. Okay, because that is the surrounding culture. So it's a little bit like the way that the modern American Christian church is deeply capitalist, because that is the culture in which we are swimming, and like trying to pull apart the church and the surrounding culture, the stuff that we live and breathe and marinate in every single day, is difficult to do. Now, this comes up in a lot of ways, in the sense that men were understood to be in their dominion was public sphere, was the marketplace, was being out and talking, and and women inhabited the domestic sphere. That was actually where they had more power than men, was in the domestic sphere, and those were separate, and each was ruled by their people. And why do I say all of this? Well, the churches, that was their norm. That had been their norm for a very, very, very long time. And changing norms like that is difficult. We all know this. We've all done our work trying to get the church away from capitalism. It's really hard to do, especially when you have new people converting in and coming in on a regular basis with these understandings in place. But we're also at a point where in when scholars think that actually Timothy and Titus, these pastoral epistles, when they were actually written, churches are becoming less about like house churches and more about like public spaces. So where are we going with this? In the beginning, Jesus and Paul both worked with a lot of women. We know that among the followers of Jesus, there were a fair few women. We talk about, Mary of Bethany with her sister Martha. Remember them? Mary and Martha. Mary Magdalene. Um, Mary, Jesus' mother, was hanging on for a fair amount of time in there. We know that. And about two other women named Joanna and named Salome, who were regulars in the Jesus movement. We don't know how many others. We don't know if the woman who anointed Jesus with perfume was any of these women or a different woman entirely. But there were lots and lots of them around. There were some who schooled Jesus. The Syrophoenician woman did. There's the Samaritan woman at the well who understood better than the man that she is contrasted with, Nicodemus. That's both in the Gospel according to John. There was an equity in the early Jesus movement. And actually, Paul kind of inhabited that. He didn't do real well. Paul had grown up. I mean, he was Jewish. He was a Pharisee. He was a rabbi. But he had very much grown up in a Greek culture. He was in the Jewish diaspora, so he grew up in a Greek culture and spoke fluent Greek, would have been very comfortable in their gender roles and in their ideology and their philosophy. And so he gets the push for equity and equality of the early Jesus movement. He is heavily financed by women. The church at Philippi would have been founded by a woman, Lydia, I think it was Philippi. The salutations of so many of Paul's letters talk about women who serve as deacons, women who serve as apostles. It is a very, very commonplace thing. And Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, notably in chapter 7, talks about marriage, talks about relationships, pretty much says the end is about to come, so don't bother getting married. Focusing on God and Jesus is so much more important than that. So, don't get married now. Don't deal with all of that. Don't get distracted. But if your lust is otherwise going to distract you, then yes, by all means, get married. That's fine too. But also, there in his descriptions of marriage, there is an equity there. He puts, he'll say, women love your husbands, but then he'd say, husbands love your wives. There is much more equity in the actual Pauline writings than we usually give him credit for. And you can see him really struggling with the difference between the Jesus movement, that early proto-Christianity that held to the complete equity of all people, and the way he'd been raised, which was that, men and women occupied different spheres. Men's is kind of sort of better, and men are kind of sort of more up in the hierarchy, but it's almost a separate but equal. It's not quite that. I mean, it's still not equal. It's the reality is separate but equal, right? It's never actually equal. But he really struggles because he kind of knows that he should be doing better. You really, when you read all the way through 1 Corinthians, you read all the way through Romans, Paul is trying. He fails in the end, but he is trying. And that's the theology that he presents, which is pushing towards equity. The other book that he wrote was actually Galatians. And in Galatians, it says, there shall no longer be Jew or Greek, slave or free, male and female are all equal in Christ Jesus. He's aspiring, I think, to that. But he is also very, very convinced that the end is near. Paul is writing from a position of enormous urgency, kind of like the gospel writers are. Let's remember that Paul is actually writing before the Gospels, right? Paul is writing before the Gospels. The earliest Christian writings that we have are letters that are actually of Paul. The Gospels came later. And even they are still really, really urgent. Like, surely, surely Jesus is coming back any day now. It's not worth like living life. We can like live into these utopian communities because it's just about to end. By the time we get to the pastoral epistles, it's been 100 years. And people are pretty like, oh yeah, this isn't going anywhere. We need to organize ourselves because now the churches are getting bigger, these communities are getting larger, and they're kind of under attack here and there. And so suddenly you see organization, you see it moving from homes out into the public sphere, you see it moving from the realm of women into the realm of men, according to Greek philosophy, and you see it taking organizational, institutional shape. You see it worrying about membership. You see it worrying about who gets to make decisions, right? So suddenly in First Timothy, we hear him talking about bishops. The word bishop comes from the Greek word overseer. So it was actually a category of labor, of work. You see like actual structured diaconates, deacons, starting to take shape, and you start seeing rules and regulations around who can and who cannot become a bishop, who can and who cannot become a deacon, all the way through. And that's really what's at stake here. So what's Timothy's deal? Timothy is, or whoever wrote the letters to Timothy, because it was not Paul. It was someone writing in Paul's name. That was a thing that happened, in the same way that, Plato didn't really write Plato, probably a lot of it. Or Aristotle didn't really write Aristotle. The students wrote in somebody's name. It was a way of paying honor and having your own stuff taken more seriously, especially in a nascent church. Which is also why he talked about Timothy, right? Like, we know Timothy traveled with Paul, so we're going to pretend we're like found a letter from Paul to Timothy, even though we didn't. I bet they like, you remember when, I don't know if you guys did this, when you like burned the edges of things to make them look like older documents, or you like stained it in tea a little bit and crinkled it up and made it. You ever do that? Did you ever antique stuff for like school projects and stuff? I'm guessing they did that too. Because that's sort of the concept. Antiquity was really antiquity was really something that had weight. If it came out of antiquity, if it was an older idea, then it must be a more meaningful idea. And so that's part of what they were doing. But the ideas in it are not Pauline in any way, shape, or form. They're trying to create an institution at this point, which is why it is so deeply, deeply misogynistic, because they're trying to justify the move out into the public sphere, and of course, women shouldn't be in the public sphere. Shouldn't be in the public sphere. They're trying to create membership. This is also a time when proto-Christian communities were not particularly well regarded by the Romans, because part of Roman culture was also to worship the emperor as a god, and the Christians were unwilling to do that. Proto-Christians were unwilling to do that. So their whole idea is to stay safe. And part of the way that they wanted to build up their communities, because there is safety in numbers, was through childbirth. So they are attempting to send women back in to make babies, right? You see that in First Timothy. It's really messed up. You see the way that widows are portrayed. And it's, part of it is, if widows are, if widows die without children, then they should get married, because the whole point is to have children, which is when this, concept of, the whole fall from grace was Eve's fault. That's going to play in this. She is saved through childbirth. They are just trying to make the church grow. in the simplest way they know how. Make the women have babies. It's a really messed up situation. And they're trying not to be persecuted. There's a whole lot of we are going along to get along. We are gonna not make waves. We are not gonna not get arrested. We are gonna just look like good little Romans doing our good little Roman thing and having church on the side. So that is essentially what is up with Timothy. Now, what happens in this process, of course, is that misogyny takes root. Because the other part of this that we have to play with, First Timothy is positioning itself as creating an institutional church. It is pushing back against certain sects of proto-Christianity, like the Gnostics. You may have heard about them. They had a very different set of understandings about how to live the gospel. They tended toward an ascetic lifestyle, so they weren't so big on like enjoying their food. You can read a little of that, First Timothy. They really didn't drink, and so Paul's suggestion that Timothy drink some wine to settle his stomach is a direct dig at them. And they weren't super big on marriage. They actually were very proto-Shaker in that regard. They didn't really get married, and they tended to take in foundlings as a way of sort of maintaining their community. And so much of the theology that you have coming out of this is a pushback against that, right? So they're actually positioning themselves, not stating what they're for, but stating what they're against. But also, they are positioning themselves to be normal in Roman culture, Greco-Roman culture, to have the men be in charge in the public sphere, which is what the church is becoming. So you end up with a lot of misogyny. Now, the final part of this final piece of context in what was Timothy's deal isn't even about Timothy or whoever wrote Timothy. It was about why is Timothy included in the canon? Because there were a lot of early Christian writings that never made it into our Bible, including the Acts of Paul and Thecla, who was a female apostle who traveled with Paul, just like Timothy did, just like Barnabas did. It was a later writing. Did Thecla exist? I don't really know. Is she a Catholic saint? Yes, she is. And those writings were possibly circulating at about the same time. Part of, again, what's Timothy's deal might have been pushing back against people, women notably, who were like, hey, Thecla could do it. Why can't I? But then why was it all included? Why was this included in the canon and that one wasn't? Because that part of the church, that institutionalized part of the church, that's what won. The question of whether women could be bishops, whether women could be deacons, whether women could serve in ministry at all was not officially dealt with for another 150 years. It was in the late fourth century, early 5th century. Sorry, I do numbers badly at sometimes, but the late 300s, the early 400s, that finally really got settled, and they were like, no, this is a boys' club, no girls have cooties, and they're the ones who made the canon. They're the ones who decided what was in and what was not in the Bible. They put in First Timothy because that backed their position up. That's pretty much how that worked. And that was, this is what Timothy's deal was, this is how we're going to create an institution. This is how we're going to make sure that the people who have had a certain amount of power manage to stay in power, even if it contradicts Paul, even if it contradicts Jesus, which is messed up. I totally agree that's messed up. Why? Yeah, and the people who include it in the canon of scripture, it's had that exact idea in mind, and it has certainly worked. It has worked for centuries to keep women out of power, to keep women out of ministry. First Timothy is a heck of a weapon that gets used. Why would we keep it in the canon of Scripture? I mean, A, that's above my pay grade. Do I ever preach out of First Timothy? No. Would I ever preach out of First Timothy? Only like this. Thank you very much. Is it, however, a very, very interesting cautionary tale for us? Yeah, it kind of is. I don't know if that's reason enough to keep it. As I said, I don't really do anything with it myself. I can't change the published Bibles that are out there at this point. That would be, again, a bigger thing than me. But I can read First Timothy kind of in the way that I read Isaiah, as what part of this feels familiar? What part of this feels like the stuff that we do on a regular basis with our own faith? And how do we understand where they went with it versus where we're going with it? And what came of it? Because we also have the benefit of hindsight that they didn't necessarily have. Is it enough? I don't know. Again, not my choice. But that's what I have been reflecting on as I read and learned as much as I could about First Timothy this week. Second Timothy has some of this. It's weirder. It's a little more personal. So I hit hard. I hit hard on First Timothy because it's the more theologically broad of the two. But that's what sort of what I got to, frankly, which is Timothy is a useful cautionary tale, and you need to read beyond the surface. That's about as good as it gets. Why did we end up with 4 gospels instead of just 1? That actually is documented. That actually is documented. They actually did want there to be 4 perspectives. They were all approximately of the same generation. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are synoptic. In other words, they share an enormous amount of material, so they corroborate each other, which was really, really useful in the early church. Each one has a little bit of its own flavor to it, which, gave them some stuff to work with that they might not have had otherwise. And John has what's called a high Christology. John's purpose is different, but they really liked the way that it showed the fully human, fully divine of Jesus, and the more poetic nature of it really appealed to the earliest members of the church. I actually love the Gospel of John. It has its problematic passages, don't they all? It has its problematic passages, but the writing in it is much more sort of our understanding. Like, it has an overarching theme. The writer pulls on imagery, sets up very structured arguments. So Jesus will do something, some sort of miracle. That's a sign in John, not a miracle, but a sign. And then we'll have a conversation with somebody about it. And then we'll turn around and explain what it's supposed to mean. And that structure is really, really interesting. It ties very consciously into the Old Testament, into the Hebrew Bible, with Jesus frequently saying, I am, which is, of course, how God presented God's self to Moses at Sinai in the burning bush. I am that which I am, or I will be that which I will be, depending on the translation. John is very thoughtfully written. It isn't just, stories put to paper, but has a distinct purpose from the very beginning. And yeah, the prologue of the Gospel of John is some of the most beautiful poetry in the Bible, in my humble opinion. And also, we get stories like the Samaritan woman at the well. John's use of light and darkness imagery. is now problematic. Now that we have had race-based slavery that didn't exist in Jesus' time. Slavery did, but race-based slavery didn't. So the concepts of light and dark were just that for them. We also get the broiled fish breakfast after the resurrection, and I love that story. That's a really wonderful one. You meet Jesus, and he makes you food. He fills you. He gives you water. He gives you food. That's a really beautiful moment. So no, I'm a fan of John. Sorry, Julian. I would actually fight you on that one. So we have time for another question if anybody happens to have one. And it can be just about anything. And Hannah, I'm glad you found that helpful. I would be interested at some point in hearing your initial take on Timothy, because that is a hell of a way to jump into Bible study. You thought I was going to say, time to fight. It's not like we can just walk out into the street and do that tonight. I'm in Pittsburgh still. So, besides, I wouldn't actually. I like you guys too much. So yeah, any other questions? Any other, hey, I heard this weird story once. Oh, there you go, Timothy Paul. That makes sense. Ew. And as I recall, Tim, your dad is a pastor, right? Did I get that right? So that actually makes sense. And was your dad the kind of pastor who would have really appreciated Timothy and Paul for all the reasons that I just destroyed? Sorry about that. Because no harm, no foul. I know a lot of people who double Bible names. Wow. Purposeful. Huh. Interesting. I wonder what he intended. That's fascinating. And the actual Timothy who traveled with Paul outside of this particular epistle in the Bible seemed like a really decent human. It's a complicated question, because in the letter to Timothy, they talk about how Timothy's third generation. His mother and his grandmother were Christians, and they brought him up in the faith, which leads back to the question of how on earth was he raised in faith from a little boy by his mother and his grandmother if he's hanging out with Paul, who is literally just barely bringing the faith to the Mediterranean basin in the first place. But that would be applying logic to the Bible, and one shouldn't do that necessarily. It doesn't always end well. Yeah. I will add one tiny thing. The only place in which I like black sheep. I think this is a church of black sheep, quite frankly. So Tim, I hope you fit right in. I hope you feel like you fit right in. The only point in which First Timothy and a letter written by Paul agree, 1 Corinthians 14 at the end of the chapter, verses 34 and 35, I want to say it is. It's one of the rare ones I can quote, which talks about women being silent in church. Those are widely agreed to be verses that Paul did not write, that were added by a scribe later on, possibly to make them agree better with First Timothy. Because if you take those verses out of 1 Corinthians and you read the passage through, it makes a lot more sense, because those are a digression from the argument, and they're just sort of stuck in the middle of an argument. So he's arguing for, I don't remember what it's for in that particular moment, something about food. I think that might be where they're talking about the food that had been offered for sacrifice. And Paul is talking about eating and food, and then is like, and women should be silent, and back to food. So no, First Timothy and actual Paul don't hang well together. So anyway, no other questions, Bill? Really? Please do try to keep them coming, though. If stuff comes up, even in the middle of a sermon, if stuff comes up as you're thinking about a sermon later, if stuff comes up as we're reading a text and you're like, that's weird, and I don't, especially if I don't talk about it, please throw it in the Ask Eliza. We will certainly do one of these again when we have a few questions in there.